The witness waiting room felt like a prison cell to Emma Martinez as she huddled in the corner chair, her small body folded in on itself like a wounded bird. The beige walls seemed to close in around her, and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows that made everything feel cold and unwelcoming. Her court-appointed victim advocate, Mrs. Chun, sat nearby, occasionally offering gentle words of encouragement that fell on deaf ears. Emma's mind kept replaying Derek's whispered threat as he passed her chair. "Good girl, keep your mouth shut, just like I taught you." Her mother, Maria, paced the small room like a caged animal, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. In an anxious rhythm, "Mia, please," she whispered in Spanish, kneeling beside Emma's chair. "You can do this. We practiced so many times." But Maria's own hands trembled as she spoke, betraying her own terror. She blamed herself for not seeing Derek's true nature sooner, for bringing this monster into their home, for putting her precious daughter in harm's way. Emma's tears had dried into salty tracks on her cheeks, but her chest still heaved with suppressed sobs. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Derek's face, heard his voice promising terrible consequences if she dared to speak. The weight of his threats pressed down on her like a physical burden. Sunshine, her golden retriever, was safe at her grandmother's house, but Derek's warning echoed in her mind. Accidents happen to pets all the time. A door to the waiting room opened with a soft click, and Emma flinched instinctively, expecting to see Derek or his attorney coming to intimidate her further. Instead, a tall figure in a crisp sheriff's uniform stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding attention. Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison was a man in his early 40s, with kind eyes and graying temples that spoke of years spent protecting others. His uniform was immaculate, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, but it was his companion that truly captured everyone's attention. Atlas was magnificent, a German shepherd whose black and tan coat gleamed with health, and whose amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. He stood at Morrison's side with perfect military bearing, his ears alert and his powerful frame radiating confidence and strength. This wasn't a pet or a therapy animal. This was a working police dog, trained for serious business. His harness bore patches identifying him as a K-9 officer, and his presence alone seemed to make the room feel safer. "Sorry to interrupt," Morrison said quietly, his voice respectful of the family's obvious distress. "I needed to check the security protocols for when court reconvenes." His experienced eyes took in the scene quickly, the terrified child, the anxious mother, the overwhelmed advocate. He'd been working courthouse security for 8 years, and had seen countless victims struggle with testimony. But something about this little girl's obvious terror struck him deeply. Atlas, however, seemed to have his own agenda. While Morrison spoke with Mrs. Chun about security arrangements, the powerful dog's attention fixed entirely on Emma. His training told him to remain in position, alert and ready, but something deeper, some instinct that went beyond his police training drew him toward the frightened child. Emma noticed the dog's intense focus on her and shrank further back in her chair. She'd always loved dogs, especially her beloved Sunshine, but Atlas was intimidating in his size and obvious strength. His amber eyes never left her face, and she found herself staring back, caught in some wordless communication she didn't fully understand. Slowly, deliberately, Atlas took a single step toward her. Morrison noticed immediately. Atlas never broke position without permission. "Atlas, stay," he commanded quietly, but the dog's ears flicked back toward his handler, while his gaze remained fixed on Emma. It was as if he were asking permission for something unprecedented. Morrison studied his partner with growing amazement. In 8 years of partnership, Atlas had been the model of professional discipline. He detected drugs with 97% accuracy, had helped locate 3 missing children, and had never once broken protocol. But now, something in the dog's body language suggested he was requesting permission to abandon his training in favor of something more important. "It's okay," Morrison found himself saying, though he wasn't entirely sure. "Why, go ahead, boy." Atlas approached Emma with the same careful precision he used when investigating suspicious packages. Each step was measured, deliberate, non-threatening. When he reached her chair, he didn't jump up or demand attention. Instead, he simply sat down beside her, his massive bulk somehow managing to appear gentle and unthreatening. Emma held her breath as the powerful animal settled beside her. Atlas was easily twice the size of Sunshine, his head level with her shoulder, even while sitting. But instead of fear, she felt something unexpected, a sense of protection, of strength being offered rather than threatened. The dog's breathing was deep and calm, and his presence seemed to create a bubble of safety around her chair. Tentatively, Emma reached out one small hand toward Atlas's head. The dog remained perfectly still, allowing her to touch his soft ears, his thick fur. The moment her fingers made contact with his coat, something extraordinary happened. The crushing weight of Derek's intimidation seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a warmth and comfort she hadn't felt since this whole nightmare began. "He likes you," Morrison observed quietly, his voice filled with wonder. In all his years with Atlas, he'd never seen the dog choose someone like this. Police Canine South were trained to work with their handlers exclusively to maintain professional boundaries at all times. But Atlas seemed to have made an executive decision that this little girl needed something more than police protocol could provide. Emma's breathing began to slow and deepen as she stroked Atlas's fur. The dog's calm strength seemed to flow into her through her fingertips. For the first time since entering the courthouse, she felt like she could fill her lungs completely. The room no longer felt quite so cold. The walls no longer seemed to be closing in. "Will you stay with me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Atlas turned his great head to look directly into her eyes, and she saw something there that made her heart flutter with hope. Without any command from Morrison, the dog's tail gave a single decisive wag, a promise sealed between them. Maria gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hands. Mrs. Chun stared in amazement. But Morrison just nodded slowly, understanding that something important had just happened, something that might change everything about Emma's testimony. In that moment, Emma felt the first stirring of courage she'd experienced in months, flowing into her through the unlikely partnership of a little girl and a police dog who decided she was worth protecting. The Riverside County Courthouse felt like a cathedral of judgment, its vaulted ceilings stretching impossibly high above 8-year-old Emma Martinez as she sat in the witness chair. The polished wooden seat, designed for adults, dwarfed her. Small frame, making her feel even more vulnerable than she already was. Her legs dangled freely, not quite reaching the floor, and she gripped the armrests with such intensity that her knuckles had turned bone white. The courtroom buzzed with the quiet energy of anticipation. 12 jurors sat in their box, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern as they studied the frightened child before them. Some leaned forward slightly, straining to hear what she might say. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps thinking of their own children or grandchildren at home. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, ready to capture every word that might emerge from Emma's trembling lips. But it was the man sitting at the defendant's table, just 20 feet away, who commanded Emma's terrified attention. Derek Thompson sat with his back straight, his broad shoulders filling out his navy suit jacket perfectly. To the casual observer, he might have appeared to be a concerned stepfather, wrongly accused and hoping for vindication. But Emma knew better. She recognized the cold calculation behind his pale blue eyes, the way his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly when he was angry, the subtle way his fingers drummed against the table, a gesture she'd learned to fear because it always preceded his explosive rages. Derek's attorney, a well-dressed woman with silver hair, pulled back in a severe bun, whispered something in his ear. He nodded slightly, never taking his eyes off Emma. When he caught her looking at him, his lips curved upward in what anyone else might mistake for an encouraging smile. But Emma saw it for what it truly was, a silent threat, a reminder of all the times he'd warned her that no one would believe her if she ever tried to tell. Who's going to listen to a lying little brat? He'd hissed during one of their private conversations after her mother had gone to bed. Prosecutor Williams approached the witness stand with careful, measured steps. She was a kind-faced woman in her 40s, with warm brown eyes and a gentle voice that had put Emma at ease during their practice sessions. She'd spent hours with Emma over the past weeks, helping her prepare for this moment, teaching her that it was okay to take her time, to ask for water if she needed it, to tell the truth in her own words. "Good morning, Emma," Prosecutor Williams said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury your full name?" Emma's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her throat felt as though it had been stuffed with cotton. She tried to swallow, but her mouth was bone dry. The water glass sitting on the small table beside her might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her. Her hands were shaking so badly, she was afraid she'd drop it if she tried to reach for it. "Take your time, sweetheart," the prosecutor encouraged, but her words seemed to come from very far away, as if Emma were hearing them from the bottom of a deep well. The courtroom waited. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft whir of the air conditioning system and the occasional rustle of clothing as someone shifted in their seat. Emma could feel dozens of eyes upon her, studying her, waiting for her to speak. Some of those gazes felt sympathetic, but others seemed impatient, skeptical. She wondered if they could see through her, if they could tell how terrified she was, if they already thought she was lying. Derek's presence seemed to fill the entire room. Even though he wasn't speaking, wasn't moving, his influence pressed against Emma like a physical weight. She remembered his voice from that terrible night 3 weeks ago, when her mother had finally gathered the courage to call the police after finding bruises on Emma's arms. "You tell them anything, and I'll make sure something happens to your precious little dog," he'd whispered when the officers weren't looking. Accidents happen to pets all the time. Emma's beloved golden retriever, Sunshine, was staying with her grandmother while the trial proceeded. The thought of anything happening to Sunshine because of her testimony made Emma's stomach twist with nausea. Derek had always been clever about his threats. Never anything that could be easily proven. Always something that sounded like concern or accident to outside ears. Judge Harrison, a stern-looking woman with silver-gray hair, leaned forward slightly. "Would you like some water, Emma? We can take a short break if you need one." Emma tried to nod, but even that simple gesture seemed beyond her capabilities. Her whole body felt frozen, as if Derek's stare had turned her to stone. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, drowning out everything else. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to flicker and buzz, making her feel dizzy and disoriented. Prosecutor Williams approached the bench for a whispered conference with Judge Harrison. Emma couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the concern on both women's faces. The defense attorney remained seated, but Derek leaned over to whisper something to her, and Emma caught a glimpse of his satisfied expression. He was winning, and he knew it. His intimidation tactics were working perfectly, just as they always had at home. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Emma sat frozen in the witness chair, her voice locked away by terror, while Derek Thompson's confident smile grew wider. She had traveled so far to reach this moment through months of counseling, police interviews, and legal preparations, only to find herself unable to speak the words that could finally set her free. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the tension, We'll take a 15-minute recess to allow the witness to compose herself. As the courtroom began to empty, Emma remained motionless in her chair, tears streaming down her cheeks, feeling as though she had already lost the most important battle of her young life. Derek stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked past her toward the door. As he passed, he leaned down just slightly and whispered, so quietly that only she could hear, "Good girl. Keep your mouth shut, just like I taught you." The words hit Emma like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears. Even here, in this place of justice, surrounded by people whose job it was to protect her, Derek's power over her remained absolute. She had never felt more alone or more afraid in her entire life. The courtroom crackled with tension as Judge Eleanor Harrison called the session back to order. The 15-minute recess had stretched to 25 minutes, giving both legal teams time to strategize and the gallery to buzz with speculation about the young witness's breakdown. Emma sat in the witness chair once more, but this time she wasn't alone. Atlas lay beside her chair in a perfect downstay position, his amber eyes alert and protective, his massive presence radiating calm strength. Prosecutor Williams approached the bench with measured confidence, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She carried a leather portfolio, thick with case precedents, her research from the extended recess. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and authoritative. "The prosecution formally requests that K-9 Officer Atlas be permitted to remain with the witness during her testimony. The child has experienced severe trauma, and the dog's presence has demonstrably calmed her enough to potentially provide testimony." The effect of her words was immediate and explosive. Defense Attorney Richards shot to his feet so quickly his chair rolled backward, crashing into the barrier behind him. His face flushed red with indignation, his silver hair disheveled from running his hands through it during the recess. "Your Honor, this is absolutely outrageous," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the courtroom's high ceilings. "This is nothing more than a theatrical stunt designed to manipulate the jury's emotions." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Reporters frantically scribbled notes while sketch artists captured the dramatic scene. This was unprecedented in Riverside County legal history, possibly in the entire state of California. Cell phones buzzed silently as news alerts began spreading across social media. Police dog requested as courtroom support for child witness. Richard strode toward the judge's bench, his expensive Italian shoes slapping against the floor with each aggressive step. "Your Honor, the presence of a police dog, a trained law enforcement animal, will create an atmosphere of guilt by association. The jury will see this imposing creature and automatically assume my client is dangerous, criminal, guilty before they've even heard the evidence." Derek Thompson sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of his chair. The confident smirk he'd worn earlier had vanished, replaced by barely contained fury. His carefully constructed facade of the wrongly accused stepfather was crumbling. The intimidation tactics that had kept Emma silent for 2 years were being neutralized by a dog, a reality that filled him with impotent rage. Judge Harrison raised her hand for silence, her weathered face grave with the weight of the decision before her. At 62, she had presided over thousands of cases, but never one quite like this. She adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, studying both legal teams with sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Richards," she said slowly, "while I understand your concerns about jury bias, I must also consider the rights of the victim to testify effectively. Prosecutor Williams, do you have case precedents to support this highly unusual request?" Williams opened her portfolio with practiced efficiency. "Yes, Your Honor. In People v. Martinez 2019, the California Court of Appeals upheld the use of a support animal during a child victim's testimony. Additionally, Federal courts have recognized similar accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act when trauma significantly impairs a witness's ability to testify. Those cases involved certified therapy animals. Richards interjected, gesturing wildly toward Atlas. This is a police canine, trained for drug detection and suspect apprehension. His very presence suggests criminality. Deputy Morrison, standing at attention near the courtroom's side entrance, watched the legal battle with growing concern. Atlas remained perfectly calm beside Emma, but Morrison could see the dog's subtle awareness of the rising tension in the room. 8 years of partnership had taught Morrison to read his canine's body language like a book. And right now, Atlas was communicating something important. This child needed protection, and he was prepared to provide it, regardless of legal technicalities. Emma herself seemed almost forgotten in the heated debate, but she was listening to every word with growing anxiety. The lawyers were arguing about her, about Atlas, but no one was asking what she wanted. Her small hand reached down to touch Atlas's head, and the dog immediately pressed against her palm, offering silent reassurance. Judge Harrison spent the next 20 minutes consulting law books, her clerk rushing to provide additional case files. The courtroom waited in electric silence, broken only by the scratch of pencils, as reporters documented every moment of this historic legal standoff. Outside, a crowd had begun gathering as word spread through social media about the unusual courtroom. Drama unfolding inside. Furthermore, Your Honor, Richards continued, his voice rising to a theatrical pitch, this sets a dangerous precedent. Are we to turn our courts into petting zoos? Will every witness demand an emotional support animal? Where does it end, horses? Elephants? This is a court of law, not a therapy session. Williams stood again, her voice steady and professional despite the circus atmosphere. Your Honor, we're not talking about emotional support animals or therapy. Pets. Atlas is a sworn officer of this department, trained to maintain discipline and order. His presence here isn't about comfort. It's about enabling justice by allowing a traumatized child to speak her truth. Derek's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he shook her off violently. His composure was fracturing as he realized. His carefully planned defense strategy, relying on Emma's silence, was being systematically dismantled. He'd counted on her terror, on her inability to speak against him. The presence of this dog threatened everything. The tension reached a crescendo when Judge Harrison finally spoke again. After reviewing applicable precedents and considering the extraordinary circumstances of this case, I am prepared to make my ruling. The courtroom held its collective breath. Emma's future, Derek's freedom, and legal history itself hung in the balance of the next few words. The court finds that the witness's right to provide testimony outweighs concerns about potential jury prejudice. Atlas will be permitted to remain, positioned between the witness and the defendant. However, she continued, raising her voice as both sides began to react, I will provide explicit jury instructions that the dog's presence relates solely to the witness's emotional state and must not influence their consideration of guilt or innocence regarding the charges. The ruling exploded through the courtroom like a lightning strike. Richards slammed his portfolio shut, his face purple with rage. Williams nodded professionally, but her eyes sparkled with victory. Derek Thompson's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold fury beneath as he realized his primary weapon fear had just been neutralized by an 80-pound German shepherd who decided to become a little girl's protector. As Atlas rose and positioned himself between Emma and Derek, the courtroom fell silent once more. History had been made, and everyone present knew they'd witnessed something unprecedented. Emma looked down at her unlikely guardian and felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years: hope. The courtroom had transformed into a theater of justice, with every eye focused on the small figure in the witness chair. Emma Martinez sat straighter now, her spine no longer curved with defeat. Atlas lay in his designated position between her and Derek, a living barrier of protection that seemed to radiate strength directly into her small frame. The German shepherd's presence had changed everything. The very air in the room felt different, charged with possibility rather than dread. Prosecutor Williams approached slowly, her movements deliberate and respectful. She had conducted hundreds of examinations, but never one quite like this. The little girl before her had undergone a remarkable transformation during the legal battle. Over Atlas's presence, where terror had once reigned in Emma's dark eyes, there now flickered something else: determination, perhaps even defiance. "Emma," Williams began gently, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "I know this is difficult, but you're very brave for being here today. Can you tell the jury your name and how old you are?" Emma's hand dropped to rest on Atlas's broad head, her fingers finding comfort in his thick fur. The dog remained perfectly still, but his amber eyes tracked every movement in the courtroom with professional alertness. "My name is Emma Sofia Martinez," she said, her voice small but clear. "I'm 8 years old, and I'll be 9 next month." A collective exhale seemed to pass through the courtroom. After her earlier breakdown, many had wondered if she'd be able to speak at all. But with Atlas beside her, something fundamental had shifted in Emma's psyche. A paralyzing fear that had trapped her words was still there, but now it competed with something stronger, the courage that seemed to flow from her canine protector. "Emma, do you see the man you called Derek in this courtroom today?" Williams continued, carefully avoiding pointing directly at the defendant's table. Emma's gaze moved toward Derek Thompson, but this time she didn't flinch or look away. Atlas shifted slightly, not enough to break his downstay command, but enough to remind her of his protective presence. "Yes," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "He's sitting right there in the blue suit." Derek's face had gone ashen. The confident predator who had terrorized this child for 2 years was watching his primary weapon fear being systematically dismantled by a police dog's simple presence. His attorney touched his arm in warning, but his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Emma, I need you to tell us about the night of March 15th. Can you remember what happened that evening?" Williams's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the kindness. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength. "When?" She opened them, her hand pressed more firmly against Atlas's head. "Derek came home really late that night," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He was drunk. I could smell it on him when he walked in. Mama was watching TV in the living room, and she asked him where he'd been." The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her stenotype machine. Even the gallery seemed to hold its breath, understanding they were witnessing something extraordinary, a child finding her voice in the face of her greatest fear. "He started yelling at her," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. With each word, Atlas remained perfectly still beneath her touch, a living anchor of calm strength. He called her terrible names, words I'm not supposed to say. Then he grabbed her by the hair and pulled her off the couch. Several jurors leaned forward, their faces reflecting growing concern and anger. In the gallery, Emma's grandmother covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks as she heard details of that horrible night for the first time. "What happened next, Emma?" Williams prompted gently. "Mama started crying and said she was sorry, but Derek didn't stop. He pushed her against the wall, and she hit her head on the picture frame, the one with my school photo in it. The glass broke and cut her cheek." Emma's voice wavered slightly, but Atlas seemed to sense her distress. The dog shifted almost imperceptibly, pressing his shoulder against the witness chair in a gesture of support. Derek's attorney started to rise, perhaps to object to the detailed narrative, but Judge Harrison fixed her with a warning stare. This testimony was the heart of the case, and the judge was not going to allow interruptions unless absolutely necessary. I ran to my room because I was scared, Emma continued, but Derek followed me. He was so angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him. His face was all red, and he was breathing really hard. She paused, drawing strength from Atlas's steady presence. He said it was my fault that Mama was getting ideas about leaving him. He said I was poisoning her against him just by existing. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Several jurors exchanged shocked glances. This wasn't just domestic violence. This was a grown man targeting a child with psychological abuse designed to destroy her sense of self-worth. He grabbed my arms really tight, Emma said, unconsciously rubbing her upper arms where faint scars still marked Derek's fingerprints. He shook me and said that if Mama ever tried to leave, he'd make sure something bad happened to me, and to Sunshine, that's my dog. He said nobody would ever believe a lying little brat like me. Derek Thompson could no longer maintain his facade of innocence. His face contorted with rage as he heard his private words of intimidation exposed in open court. His attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm, but he shook it off violently. Atlas's ears pricked forward slightly, the only sign that he'd noticed the defendant's agitation. The dog's training told him to remain in position, but his protective instincts toward Emma were clearly engaged. Deputy Morrison, standing at the back of the courtroom, recognized the subtle shift in his partner's body language and moved slightly closer, ready to intervene if necessary. But Derek was wrong, wasn't he, Emma? Williams said, her voice filled with quiet pride. People do believe you. We believe you. Emma looked around the courtroom, at the jurors who were listening intently to every word, at the judge who had fought to keep Atlas by her side, at her mother, who was crying tears of both sorrow and pride. When her gaze returned to Derek, she saw not the terrifying monster who had controlled her life, but a man whose power was crumbling with every word she spoke. Yes, Emma said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. People do believe me, and I'm not lying. She looked directly at Derek Thompson, this 8-year-old girl staring down her tormentor with the courage of a warrior. I'm telling the truth about everything you did to me and Mama. Everything. For the first time in 2 years, Emma Martinez was no longer afraid of Derek Thompson. With Atlas beside her and the truth flowing from her lips like a river breaking through a dam, she had found her voice, and it was strong enough to change everything. Emma's testimony had reached its most harrowing point. Her voice, now strong and clear, carried the weight of 2 years of accumulated terror. As she described the night, Derek had threatened her with a kitchen knife. The courtroom hung on every word, the silence so complete that the soft hum of the ventilation system seemed thunderous in comparison. Atlas remained in his protective position, his steady presence the anchor that kept Emma grounded in courage. Rather than fear, he took the big knife from the wooden block on the counter, Emma continued, her small hands demonstrating the size. The one Mama used to cut the Thanksgiving turkey. His hands were shaking because he'd been drinking so much, and his eyes looked different, like he wasn't really seeing me anymore. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The gallery was transfixed, some spectators covering their mouths in horror. But Derek Thompson's reaction was the most telling of all. His face had gone from red with rage to pale, with the realization that his most carefully guarded secret was being exposed in devastating detail. Derek held it up and said, "You see, this, you little brat? This is what happens to girls who can't keep their mouths shut," Emma recounted, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to form in her eyes. He pressed the tip against my arm, not enough to cut, but enough to hurt. He said if I ever told anyone about what he did to Mama, he'd use it for real. As Emma spoke these words, something extraordinary happened. Atlas, who had been lying in perfect professional stillness for the past hour, suddenly stiffened. His ears snapped to attention, rotating like satellite dishes honing in on a signal. His nostrils flared subtly, and his amber eyes took on an intensity that Deputy Morrison recognized immediately from their drug interdiction work. Emma, who had spent the entire recess bonding with Atlas and learning to read his subtle cues, noticed the change instantly. She had watched enough police procedural shows with her mother to recognize what was happening. Atlas was alerting to something. His body language screamed, detection. But detection of what? Her hand, still resting on his head, felt the tension that had suddenly coursed through his powerful frame. The dog's gaze was fixed laser-like on the defendant's table, specifically on Derek Thompson himself. Atlas's training as a narcotics detection dog had kicked in with unmistakable clarity. His nostrils worked subtly, processing scent molecules that humans could never detect. Every line of his body communicated the same message to those trained to read it. Controlled substances detected. Emma's heart began to race, but not with the familiar fear that had paralyzed her earlier. This was different. This was excitement, the thrill of discovery. She had developed an almost telepathic connection with Atlas over the past hour, and she instinctively understood what he was telling her. The monster who had terrorized her family was hiding something, and Atlas had found it. Derek, focused on maintaining his facade of innocence while internally raging at Emma's testimony, was completely unaware of the canine's interest in him. He had been so confident in his manipulation tactics, so certain that Emma would never find the courage to speak, that he had made a critical error in judgment. A small bag of methamphetamine sewn into the lining of his suit, jacket insurance for a celebration he'd planned after his inevitable acquittal, had never seemed like a risk. Who would think to search him in a courtroom? Emma continued her testimony while simultaneously processing this new information. Her 8-year-old mind worked with surprising sophistication as she connected the dots. Derek's erratic behavior, his explosive rages, his paranoid threats, they all made more sense now. She had always wondered why he seemed different from other adults, why his anger was so unpredictable and violent. If Atlas was right, if Derek had drugs on him right now, it would explain everything. The courtroom waited as Emma paused in her narrative, appearing to gather strength for the next part of her testimony. In reality, she was making a decision that would change everything. She looked down at Atlas, whose alert posture hadn't wavered. The dog's professional discipline kept him from vocalizing his detection, but every fiber of his being was screaming the alert to those who knew how to read the signs. Emma caught Atlas's eye and made a decision that demonstrated wisdom far beyond her 8 years. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod so slight that most observers would dismiss it as a nervous gesture. But to Atlas, who had been waiting for some signal that his detection had been understood, it was everything. A nod was Emma's way of saying, "I see you. I understand. I believe you." Atlas's tail gave the slightest movement, not a wag of happiness, but a professional acknowledgement. The communication between the girl and the dog was so subtle that most of the courtroom missed it entirely. But Deputy Morrison, trained to observe his partner's every nuance, caught the exchange and felt his pulse quicken. Derek remained oblivious to the silent drama unfolding just 20 feet away. He was too focused on trying to intimidate Emma through sheer force of will, using the same stare that had kept her silent for 2 years. But Emma was no longer the terrified child who had entered this courtroom. With Atlas as her ally and the truth as her weapon, she had transformed into something Derek had never expected to face, a victim who refused to remain silent. "Emma," Prosecutor Williams prompted gently, noticing the girl's pause. Can you continue telling us what happened after Derek threatened you with a knife? But Emma had made a different decision. The testimony about that horrible night could wait. Atlas had given her information that could change everything, and she wasn't going to waste it. She looked directly at her attorney and at Judge Harrison, her voice clear and strong. "I need to tell you something important," Emma announced, her small voice carrying a new authority that surprised everyone in the room. "Atlas is trying to tell us something about Derek, something we need to know right now." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs. Derek's attorney started to object, but Emma pressed on, her hand firmly planted on Atlas's head, as if drawing courage directly from the dog's strength. "Atlas knows something about Derek that we don't, and I think we should listen to him." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down by an 8-year-old girl who had just learned that even monsters could be caught when the right all eyes were watching. Derek Thompson's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down, triggered by a silent signal between a traumatized child and a police dog who had decided she was worth protecting. The courtroom held its collective breath as Emma's words hung in the air like smoke before an explosion. "Atlas knows something about Derek that we don't, and I think we should listen to him." The 8-year-old's declaration sent ripples of confusion through the gallery, but Deputy Morrison felt his heart rate spike as he recognized the implications. His partner's alert posture, the subtle changes in body language, the laser focus on the defendant, it all pointed to one unmistakable conclusion. Judge Harrison leaned forward, her weathered face creased with bewilderment. In 30 years on the bench, she had never had a child witness interrupt her own testimony to relay information from a police dog. "Emma, I'm not sure I understand. What exactly do you think Atlas is trying to communicate?" Emma's hand remained firmly planted on Atlas's head, drawing courage from the connection. The dog hadn't moved from his alert position, his amber eyes still fixed intently on Derek Thompson. "Atlas is a police dog, right? He finds drugs and bad things?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "Well, he's doing that police thing, and he's looking right at Derek." The words hit the courtroom like a lightning strike. Prosecutor Williams whipped around to stare at the defendant's table, her legal mind immediately grasping the explosive implications. Defense attorney Richards shot to his feet so violently that his chair toppled backward with a crash that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. "Objection! Your Honor, this is completely improper," Richards bellowed, his face flushing deep. "Red, this child cannot possibly interpret police dog behavior. This is nothing but wild speculation designed to prejudice my client." But Deputy Morrison was already moving, his years of experience with Atlas overriding any concerns about courtroom protocol. He approached the bench with purposeful strides, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 8 years of canine partnership. "Atlas is displaying classic narcotic detection behavior. His alert is unmistakable to anyone trained in canine operations." Derek Thompson's face underwent a dramatic transformation, cycling from confusion to understanding to pure panic in the span of seconds. The color drained from his cheeks as he realized his fatal mistake. The small bag of methamphetamine sewn into his jacket, lining his celebration insurance for what he'd assumed would be his inevitable acquittal, suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "This is insane," Derek exploded, abandoning all pretense of calm innocence. He jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're going to take the word of a lying kid and a stupid dog over mine? This is America. I have rights." His outburst sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Several jurors recoiled visibly, finally seeing the violent temper that Emma and her mother had endured for 2 years. The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs, as Derek's carefully maintained facade crumbled completely. "Mr. Thompson, sit down immediately," Judge Harrison commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. But Derek was past the point of rational behavior. The methamphetamine residue in his system, combined with the terror of exposure, had triggered a full psychological breakdown. "I won't sit down. This whole thing is a setup," he screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Emma. "That little brat has been planning this from the beginning. She's trying to frame me." Atlas rose to his feet, his protective instincts fully engaged. The dog's training told him to maintain position, but his bond with Emma overrode protocol. He moved closer to the witness chair, placing his powerful body between Emma and the increasingly agitated defendant. A low, warning growl rumbled from deep in his chest, the first sound he had made throughout the entire proceeding. Emma felt safer with Atlas's protection, but she was also witnessing something extraordinary, the complete destruction of Derek's power over her. The man who had terrorized her for years was falling apart in front of everyone, revealing himself as nothing more than a desperate criminal caught in his own web of lies. "Your Honor," Morrison said urgently, "I formally request permission to conduct a protective search of the defendant. Atlas's behavior indicates the presence of controlled substances, and Mr. Thompson's agitation suggests potential flight risk." Richards threw his portfolio to the floor in frustration. "This is prosecutorial misconduct of the highest order. My client is being railroaded by a child's fantasy and a dog's random behavior. I demand an immediate mistrial." But Judge Harrison had seen enough. Derek's violent outburst, combined with his obvious panic at the mention of a search, painted a clear picture. "Bailiffs, restrain the defendant immediately. Court security will conduct a thorough search for controlled substances." The next few moments unfolded like scenes from an action movie. Derek made a desperate break for the courtroom's rear exit, shoving past spectators and sending reporters tumbling from their seats. Atlas barked once a sharp, authoritative sound, and Morrison released him with a single command: "Atlas, apprehend." The German shepherd moved with lightning precision, his police training taking over completely. He intercepted Derek just 3 feet from the exit, bringing him down with a textbook takedown that sent the fugitive crashing to the marble floor. Court bailiffs swarmed the scene within seconds, handcuffs clicking around Derek's wrists as he thrashed and screamed profanities that made several spectators cover their children's ears. Emma watched the entire scene unfold with a mixture of terror and vindication. The monster who had controlled her life through fear was now face down on the courtroom floor, utterly powerless and completely exposed. Atlas trotted back to her, sighed, his tail wagging slightly, as if to say, "Mission accomplished." The courtroom was in complete chaos. Reporters shouted questions, while photographers captured every dramatic moment. Spectators stood on their seats, trying to get a better view of the unprecedented scene. Judge Harrison's gavel pounded repeatedly as she struggled to restore order. "Clear the courtroom of all media and spectators," she commanded. "This court is now a crime scene, and I want everyone except essential personnel removed immediately." As court security began the search of Derek's clothing, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in years: complete and total victory. The man who had threatened to kill her, who had made her afraid to speak, who had promised that no one would ever believe her, was now being exposed as exactly what she had always known him to be: a dangerous criminal. Atlas lay down beside her chair once more, his amber eyes watchful but calm. Together, an 8-year-old girl and a police dog had brought down a monster, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom had been transformed into a crime scene within minutes. Yellow police tape sectioned off the area where Derek Thompson lay handcuffed on the marble floor, his expensive suit torn and disheveled from his failed escape attempt. Court. Security officers worked with methodical precision, their latex gloves snapping as they prepared to conduct what would become one of the most significant searches in Riverside County courthouse history. Emma remained in the witness chair, Atlas still positioned protectively beside her, both watching the unfolding drama with fascination. The dog's tail wagged slowly, a sign of satisfaction that his detection work was being validated. Deputy Morrison stood nearby, his hand resting proudly on his partner's head, amazed at how Atlas's training had uncovered what could be the key to this entire case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Harrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of unprecedented authority, "you are about to witness the execution of a lawful search based on probable cause established by a trained narcotics detection. Dog, I want you to observe carefully, as this evidence may be crucial to your deliberations." Defense Attorney Richards sat slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, knowing his case had just imploded spectacularly. All his carefully crafted arguments about reasonable doubt had evaporated the moment his client had panicked and tried to flee. No innocent man runs from a simple search, and every person in that courtroom knew it. Senior Court Security Officer Janet Walsh approached Derek with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had conducted thousands of searches during her 20-year career. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to search your person for contraband. You have the right to remain silent during this process." Derek's response was a string of profanities, so vile that Judge Harrison immediately ordered the court reporter to strike them from the record. His face was pressed against the cold marble, but his eyes burned with hatred as he stared at Emma. Even now, defeated and humiliated, he was trying to intimidate the little girl who had brought about his downfall. Officer Walsh began with Derek's pants pockets, methodically removing and cataloging each item. A wallet containing $847 in small bills, car keys, breath mints, and a burner phone that immediately raised eyebrows among the investigators. The phone's recent call history would later reveal connections to known drug dealers throughout Southern California. Interesting choice of phone for someone claiming to be just a stepfather, Prosecutor Williams observed quietly to her assistant, making notes for the inevitable additional charges that would follow. The search moved to Derek's jacket, and Officer Walsh's experienced hands immediately detected an anomaly in the lining near the left breast pocket. "There's something sewn into the fabric here," she announced to the courtroom. "It feels like a small package, approximately 2 inches by 3 inches. Emma leaned forward in her chair, her small hands gripping the armrests with excitement rather than fear. After years of being terrorized by this man, she was finally watching him face the consequences of his actions. Atlas sensed her emotional shift and turned his great head to look at her, his amber eyes seeming to share in her satisfaction. Officer Walsh used a small knife to carefully cut the threads, holding the hidden compartment closed. The courtroom held its collective breath as she reached into the opening and withdrew a small plastic baggie containing white crystalline powder. Even from her position in the witness chair, Emma could see the substance that had probably fueled Derek's violent rages for months. "Suspected methamphetamine," Officer Walsh announced, holding the evidence bag up for everyone to see. "Approximately 15 grams, consistent with intent to distribute." She placed the drugs on the evidence table with practiced precision, then continued her search with renewed intensity. The discoveries kept coming like an avalanche of incriminating evidence. Hidden in Derek's jacket was a digital scale accurate to tenths of a gram, still bearing white residue from previous use. A small notebook contained what appeared to be transaction records, with dates, amounts, and coded customer names. Most damaging of all was a second cell phone, this one containing text messages that would later reveal Derek's extensive involvement in local drug trafficking. Scales, transaction records, 2 phones, and enough methamphetamine to qualify for trafficking charges. Officer Walsh summarized for the court record. This appears to be a significant drug distribution operation. Derek's attorney could only shake his head in disbelief. His client hadn't just been carrying drugs, he'd been running a business, and he'd been stupid enough to bring his entire operation into a courthouse where a trained canine could detect it. Emma felt a surge of vindication so powerful it almost took her breath away. For 2 years, Derek had convinced her that no one would believe her stories about his erratic, violent behavior. He'd told her she was crazy, that his sudden mood swings and explosive rages were normal. Now everyone could see the truth. Derek's violence hadn't been about anger or stress. It had been drug-fueled paranoia and aggression. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Williams said, rising from her chair with barely contained excitement, "the state moves to add charges of possession with intent to distribute, maintaining a drug trafficking operation, and bringing controlled substances into a government building." Judge Harrison nodded grimly. "Motion granted. Mr. Thompson, you are hereby charged with additional felonies that carry mandatory minimum sentences. Your bond is revoked, and you will be held without bail pending trial on these new charges." Derek's response was to curse Emma with language so vicious that several jurors visibly recoiled. But his words no longer held any power over her. Emma Martinez, the 8-year-old girl who had entered this courtroom unable to speak, now stared down her former tormentor with the confidence of someone who had seen justice served. "You can't scare me anymore," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom despite its softness. "Everyone knows what you really are now." Atlas's tail wagged approvingly as Derek was hauled to his feet and led away in chains, his threats and curses echoing off the marble walls until the heavy courtroom doors slammed shut behind him. The monster who had terrorized a family for 2 years was finally caged, and his cage was going to be a prison cell for decades to come. As court officers processed the evidence and prepared for Derek's transportation to county jail, Emma realized that her testimony was no longer needed. Atlas's nose had provided more proof of Derek's dangerous nature than her words ever could. The little girl and the police dog had done more than seek justice. They had exposed a criminal operation and probably saved other potential victims from Derek's violence. For the first time in 2 years, Emma Martinez was truly, completely safe. 6 months after the most dramatic courtroom scene in Riverside County history, Emma Martinez stood at the podium of Lincoln Elementary School, her voice clear and confident as she addressed an auditorium filled with wide-eyed 4th graders. The transformation was remarkable. The terrified 8-year-old, who once couldn't speak in court, had become a 9-year-old advocate who spoke at schools across 3 counties, sharing her story of courage and the unlikely partnership that had changed everything. "Sometimes heroes don't look like what you expect," Emma said, her small hands gesturing toward the side of the stage, where Atlas sat in perfect attention beside Deputy Morrison. The magnificent German Shepherd wore a special ceremonial collar for these presentations, his amber eyes alert and proud as he watched Emma speak. "Atlas taught me that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared." The sentencing hearing had been swift and decisive. Derek Thompson received 25 years for child abuse, domestic violence, and witness intimidation, followed by an additional 15 years for drug trafficking, possession with intent to distribute, and operating a criminal enterprise. The judge had been particularly harsh about the courthouse incident, adding extra time for attempting to flee justice and bringing controlled substances into a government building. At 43 years old, Derek would be nearly 80 before he saw freedom again if he lived that long in prison. The drug investigation had uncovered a network that stretched across 4 counties. Derek's cell phone records revealed connections to suppliers in Mexico and distributors throughout Southern California. His customer list led to 17 additional arrests, dismantling an operation that had been poisoning communities for years. Emma's courage in speaking up had inadvertently helped law enforcement solve cases they'd been working on for months. Emma's mother, Maria, sat in the front row of the school auditorium, tears of pride streaming down her cheeks as she watched her daughter inspire other children. The past 6 months had been transformative for both of them. They'd moved to a sunny apartment in Oceanside, 3 hours away from the memories and nightmares of their old life. Maria had found work as a bilingual teacher's aide, finally able to pursue her education degree without Derek's sabotage and threats. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. Girl and police dog exposed drug ring had made national headlines, with major networks requesting interviews and documentary producers calling daily. But Emma's victim advocate, Mrs. Chun, had carefully managed the exposure, ensuring that Emma's healing remained the priority. The interviews they did accept focused on child advocacy and the importance of speaking up about abuse. The most important thing I learned, Emma continued her presentation, is that you don't have to face scary things alone. Sometimes help comes from places you never expected, like a police dog who decided I was worth protecting. Deputy Morrison stepped forward to address the children. At 51, he had become something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles. His partnership with Atlas studied at K-9 training academies across the country. Atlas and I have been partners for 9 years, he said, his weathered face softening as he looked at the dog who had become more than just a working animal. But he taught me something new that day in court. Sometimes the most important police work isn't about following orders, it's about following your heart. The story had sparked nationwide discussions about using support animals in courtrooms. 12 states had passed legislation making it easier for traumatized witnesses, especially children, to have emotional support during testimony. The Atlas Protocol had become standard training for courthouse K-9 units, teaching officers to recognize when their dogs might provide crucial support to vulnerable witnesses. Atlas had been honored with commendations from the Sheriff's Department, the District Attorney's Office, and the State Attorney General. A bronze plaque in the courthouse lobby commemorated his service, reading, "In recognition of K-9 Officer Atlas, whose dedication to protecting the innocent exemplifies the highest ideals of law enforcement." But his greatest reward was the joy he found in visiting schools with Emma, watching children light up as they learned about courage from an unlikely teacher. Emma's weekly therapy sessions had evolved from trauma treatment to empowerment training. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, her psychologist, marveled at the child's resilience. Emma has transformed her victimization into advocacy, she explained to Maria during one session. Her partnership with Atlas gave her more than emotional support. It gave her a sense of agency, the knowledge that she could make a difference. The presentation concluded with Atlas demonstrating his detection skills, finding hidden tennis balls that the children had helped hide around the auditorium. But the real magic happened afterward, when Emma and Atlas worked together to comfort a shy third grader who had been too afraid to ask questions during the presentation. "Are you scared sometimes?" the little boy whispered to Emma as Atlas gently nuzzled his hand. "Every day," Emma replied honestly, "but being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. Atlas taught me that even the biggest, strongest dogs get scared. Sometimes. The difference is, they don't let fear stop them from protecting people they care about." As the school day ended, and they prepared to leave for their next presentation at a middle school in San Diego, Emma reflected on how much had changed. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they were fading. The fear that had once controlled her life had been replaced by purpose, a mission to help other children find their voices before the silence could trap them. Derek Thompson's appeals had been rejected at every level. Prison reports indicated he was struggling with the reality of his situation, his drug-fueled arrogance replaced by the harsh awakening that his victims had found their power. Emma rarely thought about him anymore, except to feel grateful that other families were safe from his violence. "Ready for the next school?" Morrison asked as they loaded into the specially equipped van that had become their mobile classroom. Emma climbed into her seat, Atlas immediately settling beside her with the natural ease of a partnership that had saved more than just one little girl's testimony. "Ready," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned that even the smallest person could roar when they had the right ally by their side. As they drove toward their next presentation, Emma realized that her story wasn't really about the day a girl and a dog brought a courtroom to a halt. It was about what happened next, how victims could become survivors, how survivors could become advocates, and how the courage to speak truth to power could ripple outward to protect others from the darkness. Together, Emma Martinez and Atlas had proven that heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the most powerful partnerships are born in the most unlikely circumstances.